What am I going to do? Have you ever said that phrase before? What am I going to do? Hopefully you haven't had to say that too recently, because typically when we say that phrase, it means that something has not gone according to plan. It means that we have a problem. Now, sometimes it's a small problem, like the other day I wanted to go out to eat to get some dinner, and I didn't know what I wanted to eat. And so I said, what am I going to do? I don't know what I want to eat tonight. But other times we use this phrase when we're talking about a much bigger problem that we have on our hands. This past summer, I had the awesome opportunity to do a student internship out in Baltimore, Maryland. And it was an incredible experience. I loved it. And for most of the internship, things were going really, really well until I got to the last 2 weeks of the internship. The last 2 weeks, they were CIY weeks. And so while the youth pastor took the middle schoolers one week and the high schoolers the other week, I stayed behind and led the youth group for the group that wasn't going to CIY. So when the high schoolers were at Move, I led the middle school youth group and vice versa. Now, I've been working all summer planning this event. This was the very first time that I was going to be in charge of something, that my boss wouldn't be there. This was kind of like my thing that he had given me the responsibility to take care of. And so I planned this big Summer Olympics outdoor extravaganza. It was going to be awesome. I spent the whole summer planning it. We all got there. We had all the middle schoolers there. Things were going great. I divided them up into teams. And the very first event that we had planned was a flag making contest, because I was like, we'll have them make their own team flag. It'll be like team spirit and all that, and then they can go do the rest of the events outside. And so I gave them some big white flags. I gave them some colorful duct tape and a bunch of Sharpies. And said, hey, go knock yourself out. Take 10 minutes and design a cool flag. And we were doing the event outside, but it's kind of hard to draw on a flag on asphalt. And so we all went inside to the church lobby, because the church had one of those sleek, modern warehouse designs. It was the big, sleek concrete floor. They had a giant white logo of the church in the middle. It was kind of fancy and stuff like that. And so I was like, hey, throw your flag on the ground, go ahead, make the flags, and then we're good. And they made the flags, and they were actually pretty cool. But then when they lifted up the flags to judge, to my horror, I saw that the flags, the Sharpies, had bled through the flags. And exact imprints of the flags were left all over the really nice, fancy lobby floor of this church that I was interning at. The very first time I had been left in charge, I had defaced the lobby floor of this church. And let me tell you, I tried everything to get those out. The first thing I did is I ran to the bathroom, and they had one of those automatic paper towel dispenser things that only has one speed. And so I'm standing there waving my hand, and it's just coming out one at a time. And I tried to wipe it up with that, and that didn't work. I got rags, I got a mop, I got the towels that we use after baptisms. None of that did the trick. I got a big gallon of bleach, and I used way too much bleach on that floor, and nothing worked. Finally, I was able to get some magic erasers, and thank God for magic erasers, because I was able, after 2 hours of scrubbing, to get most of the flags up off the floor. And I say most because the red team used this one neon red Sharpie where they all signed their names into the flag. And I don't know what it was about that Sharpie, but no matter what, I could not get these middle schoolers' signatures off of the big white logo in the middle of this lobby floor. I couldn't do it. No matter how hard I tried, no matter what I did, I couldn't fix things. I couldn't make things perfect. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Now, I understand hopefully none of you have ever been in a situation where you're standing there and at your feet is the signature of Gabe Wigley, a 7th grade boy in the middle of the lobby floor of this church you're interning at. But have you ever been in a situation where no matter what you do, you can't make things perfect? You can't make things right. You can't reach your ultimate goal. And it might be in random situations, but I think that's also just in life. Because on our own, we can't be perfect because sin is in the world. Sin keeps us from reaching our goal. Sin keeps us from being perfect, from getting everything the exact way that they want to be and that we want them to be. We can't do it on our own. And when we fail, we get filled with shame and guilt. We get discouraged and we feel trapped. But that's where hope comes in. Hope. It's one of my favorite words in the Bible. We use it all the time. And as I was preparing for this sermon, I did a little looking at the context of the way that this word is used in the Bible. And I found that it actually has another connotation sometimes when it's used. That oftentimes in the Bible, when the word hope is used, it comes with the connotation of anticipation, of anticipating, of looking forward to something. So you could say that to have hope means to look forward to what is ahead, to look forward to what is coming, something that's exciting, something that sets us free. You know, as I stood there and looked at the floor and saw those bright neon red signatures in the floor. I knew that I was going to have a difficult conversation with my boss. I knew that things were not going to be all fine and dandy forever, but I also knew that in a week and a half, they already had plans to repaint the lobby floor. I had hope because I knew how things were going to end. I had hope because I knew that things would be made new and that I would be all right. And that leads us into the passage that we're going to be in today. So turn with me, if you will, to Revelation chapter 21. And we're going to be in Revelation chapter 21 today and looking at an image of how John gives us hope. So I'm going to start off today by reading the first 3 verses. John writes, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God.'" These verses give us reason to hope. If we go ahead and start from the beginning and we look at verse 1, we see that John sees a new heaven and a new earth because the first heaven and the first earth passed away. It's a little interesting saying, right? We have this new heaven and new earth coming up and the old one's going away. It can be kind of confusing to understand what that means. And again, this is where we need to look at what John's alluding to. And here he's referencing Isaiah chapter 65. And in Isaiah 65, he's talking about this new heaven and new earth, not out of fear or being scared, but he's talking about it out of a spirit of rejoicing, out of celebrating. A day will come when God will make things new. And I think this verse is really interesting because the only description that we get of this new heaven and this new earth is that there won't be a sea. When I first saw this, I found that this was a little interesting, right? It's like, why no sea? Why doesn't he talk about mountains or rivers or valleys? Why does he talk about the sea? Does God have something against swimmers? Like what's going on here? And this is where the context of Revelation really helps us out, because we only have to go back a couple verses, back to Revelation 20, verse 13, and we see that the sea is the place where Hades dwells. The sea is the place of the dead. The sea is the place of the enemy. If we go back even further into the Old Testament, especially in the prophets, we see numerous examples of when God fights against the sea, of when God is victorious over the sea, of when there is glory, when God vanquishes the sea. You see, the sea represents death. It represents evil. It represents the evil one. And so when we see that there won't be any sea, we see that there won't be any evil or death or suffering or pain. That sounds like reason to hope. As we move on to verse 2, we get this really interesting image. We see a holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride. And again, this is a little strange at first. Like, think of like a city like floating down from heaven. When I first read this, I thought of Avengers Age of Ultron and like the city like flying up in the sky. And I was like, that's a weird image. But to understand what's going on here, I think the context of the book of Revelation can really help us out again. Because here we see that the city is compared to a bride. If we just go back 2 chapters in Revelation to Revelation 19, we see that the church is compared to the bride of the Lamb. The church is compared to the bride of Christ. And on top of this, if we look at just New Testament authorship as a whole, oftentimes when they write about a city, they write about the people of that city. So if I were to talk about Joplin, I wouldn't be talking about the physical city of Joplin, but I'd be talking about the people who live within Joplin. And so it seems that when John sees this vision of the new Jerusalem coming down, he's talking about the people of the new Jerusalem, the people of the new covenant, the bride of Christ. He's talking about the church. He's talking about those who have faith and those who believe will come down like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And what happens next? Well, what happens next is God will dwell with his people. God will come and dwell with them. Sin will no longer separate us from God, but we will be able to dwell with God. And I don't know about you, but that sure sounds like reason to hope. As we move to verse 4, John continues recording this vision, and he says, God will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. All these things that come with sin will be gone because the old order is gone. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. God will comfort us and God will dwell with us and He will be our God. That sounds like reason to hope. So when we go through the things described here in verse 4, when we're faced with the reality of death of ourselves or a loved one, when we cry, when we mourn, when we feel pain and discouragement and betrayal, we can have hope because we can look to a day that is coming when God's transcendence will give way to His immanence and when we will dwell with Him. I love this passage in Revelation. I love this passage because John gives us so much reason to hope for the future, but I also love this passage because John gives us a reason to hope right now. See, I think as humans, it's great to know how things are going to end. It's great to have hope for the future, but sometimes we just need enough to get us through this day because sometimes the future feels really far away. To illustrate my point, when I was a younger kid, I used to drive my parents insane with the phrase, "Are we there yet?" I'm sure none of you ever said that to your parents on a long car drive, but I would ask this question over and over constantly. I'd ask it like every minute. Like it didn't matter if we were an hour away, if we were 5 minutes away, if I could see the neighborhood coming up around the corner, I would always ask, "Are we there yet?" And they would answer me. And I'd sit there and little Jack would be content for, 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds, that might be pushing it. And then I'd ask again, "Are we there yet?" And I think the reason I would ask that question so many times is I'd get an answer and it would satisfy me, but then I'd get bored. And the future felt really far away and I was concerned with that present moment, and so I'd ask again, "Are we there yet?" My point is, as humans, it's great to know what's going to happen. It's wonderful to have hope for the future, but sometimes we just get worried and caught up in the present moment. And we go through tough times and we need a reason to hope right now. As we continue reading these next two verses, we're going to see why we can hope. In verse 5, we read that He who is seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then He said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." We get a new speaker in this vision. Finally, the one who is seated on the throne speaks. God speaks, and His words are trustworthy and true. He is on the throne. He is the ruler. He is the king. He is in charge. And notice what He says. He says, "I am making everything new." It's not "I will make everything new." It's not "I already made everything new." No, He says, "I am making everything new." It's a present tense verb. God is actively moving to make us new, to renew us, to renew the world. And as we get to verse 6, we see that God says, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life." This phrase Alpha and Omega is used several other times in Revelation. And even those of us who haven't taken much Greek know that Alpha and Omega means beginning and the end. What God is saying is, hey, I was there at the beginning of history. I'm going to be there at the end of history. I'm in control of it all. I'm over it all. I'm over this moment right now. God is on the throne. God is in control. And what is He doing? Well, He gives us water without cost from the spring, the water of life. Sounds a whole lot like the living water we get in John chapter 4. And we know that this water of life, this living water, is the water that sustains us, that gives us eternal life, that gives us reason to hope. What God is saying in these two verses is that we don't have to worry because He is in control. He is on the throne. He is actively working in our lives, and He is the one who sustains us. He is with us so we can have hope. This passage in Revelation shows us that we can have hope both now and for the future. We can have hope because God is on the throne. We can have hope because God is on the throne. So when we go through difficult times, when we're facing burnout, when we're faced with the death of a close loved one or a difficult diagnosis, we can have hope. When we're feeling discouraged, when we're feeling lonely, when we have serious questions about what our future is going to look like, or if we're being honest, this week's homework is a lot. And we just need to make it through the week. We can have hope because God is on the throne. God is working now and forevermore, and we know how the story ends, so we can have hope. And we can persevere through those tough times because hope inspires perseverance. because we know the end of the story. I love this vision that we get here in Revelation chapter 21, this vision of hope. That no matter what happens, we can persevere and we can look forward to what is coming. We can have hope because God is on the throne.